Okay, folks, this is episode 45, I believe, of Going South, this little podcast in the deep, deep south of the state of Georgia. I'm excited today to have Paul Kivel on. I've been following his work for decades now. I was just talking with him before we started recording about the fact that he was one of the first white men that I stumbled across that wrote critically about masculinity and manhood and men's violence. And that work was, and his writing was really liberating in many ways for me. So I'm excited to get to chat with him today. For those of you who don't know his work, Paul is a veteran social justice educator, an activist, and an author. He's been a leader in kind of violence prevention for more than 4 decades. Do you hail from Oakland? Has that been home or?
I grew up in Southern California.
Okay.
But I've been here for 45, 50 years now, so.
I got you. 13 books you've authored, I think?
I haven't counted them.
There's a bunch. Well, and then some of them have multiple editions, right? Some newer editions, right?
And some of them are curricula for educators and for young people to use.
Yeah, 3 that have really struck me. I'm reading this currently, Living in the Shadow of the Cross. And thanks for sending this when I ordered this. So this has been a really interesting thing, especially coming from...
Your listeners can't see those covers. So
yeah, this is a Living in the Shadows of the Cross, Understanding and Resisting the Power and Privilege of Christian Hegemony. We live on the buckle of the Bible Belt here, so I encourage folks to pick this one up. And I didn't mention this to you, but I was a Southern Baptist missionary in the Philippines, so I come from this world that you write so clearly about. But and then there's men's work, How to Stop Violence That Tears Our Lives Apart. There's multiple editions of that. I've assigned that in courses I've taught on masculinity. And then another book that I found really important was Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. And I think you have a 4th edition of that out. And there's a manual that goes with that as well, right?
Not a manual, but woven into the book are a lot of exercises and questions and suggestions and guidelines and things.
I got you. Yeah, I will put a link to Paul's website where you can find all this stuff and more about who he is in the description below the video. So that will be there for folks. If we can just start off from the beginning for you, because again, those of us who grow up in conservative places don't run across progressive men. And you have a very thorough intersectional analysis. You talk about Christian hegemony, masculinity / patriarchy, misogyny, white supremacy, militarism, right? And I think you do a really great job of weaving those things together and how they support one another. But where did that analysis come from?
That's a good question.
A big question.
A big question. I'll just say briefly, I became an activist, excuse me, in college in the late 60s, around doing work against the US war in Vietnam and some racial justice work on the campus I was at. And then in the time of the women's liberation movement in the later in the 70s, in responding to women who were on the front lines of working with survivors of male violence, domestic assault prevention workers and sexual assault prevention, things like that. We set up the Oakland Men's Project to work with men around issues of male violence. So I had already some experience working around racial justice issues. And then, of course, there was a lot of feminist discussion and writing about sexism and misogyny. But it was really at that point, this group, Oakland Men's Project, we decided we were invited into the schools to work with young people, especially young men, in communities around the Bay Area. And we went in with a very simple message to them. You're hitting your girlfriends and you should stop that. Right, this was kind of the message we were getting from the women that we were talking with. And it made sense, but they weren't buying it. This was in multi-class, multiracial, very diverse communities around the Bay Area, Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, et cetera. They said, on the one hand, they were very open and honest about talking with us about this stuff, but they said, sometimes we do hit our girlfriends. But if you're serious about helping us deal with the violence in our lives, then you have to be looking at gangs and fights and bullying and gay bashing and violence in our families, and all of the different kinds of interpersonal violence that we're dealing with. And they said, in addition to that, it's not just the interpersonal violence. Look at the state of our schools. Look at the racial profiling that we meet with on the streets. Look at the, lack of infrastructure in our neighborhood and the toxic dumping in our, in our neighborhoods. We are dealing with levels of institutional. They didn't use this vocabulary, but they were naming things that we're talking about the institutional levels of violence that they were experiencing. So at that point, we were serious about what we were doing in terms of learning from doing it and learning from the people we were working with. And so we had to go back to the drawing boards and say, so what are we trying to do here? And are we really providing support for these young people? And if we want to do that, how do we tie all this together? How do we make sense of the connections and contradictions that they're living in? So that's really the beginning of our, transforming our work into responding to the needs of the young people that we were trying to work with, as well as the adults that we were working with.
Was that a shift for you? Because you're kind of making a really important point about how our culture tends to individualize violence, right? Versus seeing it as a social cultural phenomenon. I mean, did you all have to reorient to that challenge?
Absolutely. We basically had to go back to the drawing boards because these issues were very siloed. We had a women's movement that wasn't dealing with race and class issues at all, particularly, or just occasionally. Civil rights movement that had really minimized the contributions of women and issues of gender justice.
And had been sexist at times, right?
Yeah, clearly. And people who were working on issues of economic inequality weren't dealing with race and gender particularly. So we were really challenged to find ways to work with young people and adults, developing exercises and processes and interactive kinds of forms of educational materials that actually helped young people and adults talk across their differences and come together and realize their common interest in working for social, racial, economic justice.
Did that include, I mean, because you were talking about physical violence at that time, was it a more sophisticated conversation about controlling behavior, psychological, sexual violence? Was all that there too, or did that grow out of that?
It was there pretty much from the beginning, mostly because the women's movement was really dealing and making visible a lot just the levels of those kinds of abuse, talking about the cycle of violence and the control wheel and certain tools that had been developed or developing during that period. So yeah, we were definitely, since then there's been a lot more analysis and work around issues of historical trauma and the trauma of interpersonal violence and things. So today we're at a really different kind of place than we were back in the 80s when we were first, developing this work. Yeah. We were constantly learning and in conversation and dialogue with people doing grassroots work in our communities to try to adapt and make the work relevant and applicable for the people we were working with.
Yeah. Were you able to position yourself in that work and all this work? And what I mean by it is a lot of us got into social justice work thinking we were going to go fix those people, whoever those people, other men, white people, right? But did you always know you were implicated in all of that as well?
Not particularly. I mean, that was part of the initial flaw of our model, was that we were going to go in and save young people from the violence they were experiencing, right? And you know, that comes from a very dominant Christian salvation narrative,
Right.
Proselytizing, conversion,
Yeah.
saving people, and you know, progressives have often fallen into that same trap of thinking we have the answers, we know what's best, and the problem, we don't have anything to do with the problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, no, we were carrying all that stuff into there.
Did you, because let me use a different example. When did you know you were white and part of a white supremacist society?
I really, that really goes back to the late 60s when I was working on my college campus, because the Black students were really upset with the white supremacy culture of the campus, the predominance of whiteness everywhere, and the lack of an educational curriculum that met their needs. So they took over the administration building and demanded a Black Studies program. And at that point, you know, they came to some of us who were white, angry and upset about what was going on. And my first response was a kind of a typical white response of, well, I'm not racist. I treat everybody with respect. I'm a good person. You know, it's not me.
Right.
All those things that we say if we're white or male, or, you know, we're trying to slip away from responsibility or accountability for actually doing anything about it. So they basically said, well, that's fine, but there's racism in our communities, in our educational system, in the healthcare system, and everywhere we go. Do you stand with us in the struggle for racial justice? And that was a harder question to answer, because they weren't asking what I thought or believed. They were asking, what am I doing? You know, how am I showing up? And so at that point, it was really clear that I was white. And one of the things they were saying was, we need two things. We need direct logistical support, direct solidarity, you know, food, messages sent back and forth, communications, all that kind of stuff. And so we set up a kind of a network to be able to provide that kind of stuff. But the other thing they said was, we need you to talk to other white people, because the students, the faculty, the administration don't have a clue what this is all about, or what we're really up against. And at that point, I realized not only that I was white, but I was scared to talk with other white people, and I didn't have a clue what to say or how to talk to other white people. So it was very clear to me from then on that I was white and had a certain responsibility, because I was implicated in this whole system.
Was that a painful realization? Because I think that is such a sticking point for so many people. And what I see is us fight against it when it's proposed to us. It's almost like we have a psychic wall up, and it may be just because of individualism, right? But was that a hard pill to swallow?
Yeah, it was pretty devastating. I didn't know what to do with it, on the one hand, but also like most people in this dominant Christian society, we place great value on our personal moral worth, right? And are we good people or not? Are we going to be saved or not? And so to be implemented in a system of oppression, or to be implemented in a system of violence, meant that, I'm not as good as I think, as I thought I am.
Right.
And therefore, that personally can be a really big stumbling block, because we just get paralyzed. And then we get in this place of protesting, but I am a good person, but I'm not racist, right? You must be wrong. You know, and so, yeah, and the same thing happened 10 years later when the women's liberation movement came along. I had the same response when they were talking about how much male violence there was. As, you know, I was saying, well, I don't hit my partner, right? I treat women with respect. I do the chores and the childcare and all that. And it was that same visceral response. It's not me. I'm not responsible. I'm not connected to this.
Yeah, we have this process of personalizing it, right? And I guess the other thing, and not to belabor this point so much, but I really wanted to pick your brain about, because you've worked with and facilitated so many groups talking about these issues. I mean, are there any things that you've seen that help folks in dominant groups like being white or being male kind of get over the paralysis, the anger, the defensiveness? Or is that just a slow process that people have to kind of work out at their own pace?
I think two things make a difference. One is having other people like you be able to stay with you in that process and call you in, rather than say, yeah, you're all messed up, you're ignorant, you're not with it or whatever. And so I'm part of this national organization called SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is about calling in white people to be able to work in multiracial alliance. And a lot of that work is about supporting people going through that process and dealing with not just feeling like they've been criticized and thrown away, but that they're being invited in to stay with it. The other thing I think is so important is to realize that it's not about me. It's not about you. This is about systems of oppression. And that's not a framework we're commonly used to thinking about in our society. We mostly think about racism as interpersonal acts, of prejudice or hate crimes or whatever. But once you can begin to see how these systems operate at an institutional level in all aspects of our society, then you begin to say, oh, well, it's not me. I'm implicated. I'm in the middle of this. And I have a role to play, but I am not responsible. I didn't create the system. I don't like it. And I'm going to do what I can to change it. So it takes some of the onus off that individual guilt and fragility by being able to understand the institutional nature of this.
Yeah. Have you ever, I know Robin DiAngelo's got like fragility out there, and you just used a word that I use often, paralysis, right? It's almost like we need an essay or a book on white paralysis, this kind of process that we go through. And I've often wondered if part of whiteness seems to me, in addition to kind of individualism, but it's kind of a narcissism where I know I've made a lot of things about me that aren't about me. And I've seen folks of color really struggle with me and it can flip, right, where they're taking care of me and so forth, instead of me being able to step back and realize, no, this isn't about Mark. It's something much bigger,
Right. Well, and I think the other thing is that most white people live in highly segregated communities and social networks. And so it's easy to say racism is something over there or out there or someplace else. So, I come back to asking people, well, who made your clothes? Who are those workers? Where do they live? How are they treated? And of course, most of them are women and young women of color in this country and overseas. Who made your cell phone and computers, right?
Picks your food. We can go down a litany.
Yeah, who picks your food? Who transports it? Who prepares it? Who works in the slaughterhouses, etc. And with just a few of those kinds of self-reflective questions, we can begin to see that we are intimately interconnected and interdependent with people all around the world, most of whom are being exploited to our benefit. And there's no way to avoid the implications of what that means and the responsibility that comes from that.
I don't want to, again, belabor this too long, but I'm always interested in why people take the paths they do. And I always get asked this, especially by folks of color, but why do you think you were receptive to the challenge you got in college from those folks of color? I mean, were your parents progressive? Were they, you know what I mean? Because I've also seen a lot of liberal folk step into the fray for a little while, and they can talk about white privilege and all kinds of privilege, right? But they slowly fade away over time. But I'm just wondering if you have any theories about why you were able to work through all these and why you weren't defensive from the get-go when you were challenged both by folks of color as well as women.
I did not grow up in a progressive family. It was a pretty conservative, upper middle class, suburban, white Jewish, community in Los Angeles. Really going away to college. But I think a lot of it was that I was living in a time where there was tremendous upheaval in our society, and both around race and about the war and other things, people were being asked to take sides, to take a stance. And of course, a lot of people refused to do that or backed away. But a whole lot of us really were confronted with, what do we stand for? How are we going to show up? How are we going to respond to the civil rights movement? How are we going to respond to the anti-war movement? And so I don't think there was anything particularly unique about me. A lot of us responded. I think one of the things, though, was that not a lot of people were able to sustain that. And I think that that's something we've learned over the decades, is that it's not just about showing up once in a while or showing up now and then fading away for the next 20 or 30 years,
Right.
but it's how do you sustain a practice of showing up as an ally every day in your life, in your workplace, in your school, in your neighborhood, etc. And so a lot of the work that we did over the years was really about this concept of what does it mean to show up as an ally?
Hmm.
What does it mean to be able to sustain that commitment, to understand the long-term nature of these struggles? And so that, I think that's a crucial piece that we've become much better at understanding.
Yeah. Can I ask about your Jewish identity for a second? Because a lot of Jewish folks I know have struggled with being Jewish, but also racialized as white. Was that ever a struggle?
Well, I grew up in ignorance of the diversity of the Jewish community, and assuming that all Jews were white.
Right. Right.
And there was a history of Jewish social justice values and Jewish participation on that basis. But I didn't grow up with any role models for how to actually be Jewish and white. And a lot of the prerequisites for being active politically was to acknowledge being white, but not acknowledge the complexity of being white for so many different kinds of people, including Jews. And so there was a period in which I was not very visible being Jewish. I wasn't showing up as being Jewish and white. I was showing up as being white and anti-racist. And I think that was a sad period of the struggle in the white community around this, that we weren't, as Jews, we weren't able to show up in our full strength and creativity and culture because it was looked on suspiciously as if we were trying to get out of being white.
Yeah.
And we weren't able to acknowledge the significant percentage of Jews of color in Jewish communities. So we were also perpetuating continuing white dominance in Jewish spaces as well.
Yeah. When did the Christian piece, I guess, as a Jewish person, right, the Christianity is much more glaring, right, than those of us who were literally and figuratively baptized in that tradition, right? When did Christian hegemony come on your radar? And was it around the same time you were doing the race and the gender work?
No, it came quite a bit later, actually. I began to see, and this was in the 90s, that there were some fundamental values and worldview that really helped to understand how race and class and gender, sexual orientation, and other systems of oppression worked and operated, what kept them in place. And at the same time, it was much more visible the powerful wealth and political power of Christian institutions.
Hmm.
And by that, I mean not just churches, but denominations, parachurch organizations, powerful Christian leaders. And so I began to try to piece out and begin to talk about how Christian hegemony is one of the pillars which holds all of these systems in place.
Right.
And that became more and more clear to me. And as I talked with people more, and we began to develop a vocabulary around it, because I use the word hegemony which really just means dominance, but it means dominance that's so deep and long-standing and pervasive that we don't see it anymore. It's just the
"Quote unquote" normal.
Normal, yeah. And so it's been part of the work has been being able to name that. Now, when I start having conversations with folks, whether they're Christian or not Christian, people have very deep, ambivalent, and complex relationships with dominant Christianity. And so, if you're Christian but you're female, or Christian but you're queer, or Christian but you're Black, there's a very complicated history there. And so there's ways into understanding the power and privilege of dominant Christianity from within Christian, for Christians within that system, as well as all of those on the outside who are under attack by it.
Yeah. When you've also, you and I, more so you, I'm a little younger, not much, but we've also kind of seen the politicization and weaponizing of Christianity really since Reagan, right? The Pat
Right.
Robinsons, the moral majority, and really the fusion of Christianity and politics in a way that's terrifying,
Right. It's been developing since the 70s, really. And it's definitely part of the ruling class. It's not just their agenda, it's their identity.
Right.
And so it has been more and more blatant. But still, it's surprisingly not visible in some ways. People have been talking about the January 6th uprising as Christian nationalists, as white nationalists,
Right.
but not naming it as white Christian nationalists, right?
Yeah.
And yet Christianity was so visible in what they did and what they said and how they organized. So we still have to get better at naming the Christian part of what we're up against in terms of the systems that are working against us.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Chris Hedges' work on this? Christian fascism, basically, and his book on it. And again, I come out of that faith tradition. I'm kind of a secular Christian at this point, coming out of the liberation theology traditions of Cone and other folks, right? But it is not discussed at all. And it's kind of ubiquitous and like you said, hegemonic, like it's just in the air that folks seem to breathe.
Well, and I think it's important that when I say Christian hegemony or Christian dominance, I'm not talking about individual Christians who have lots of different relationships with dominant Christianity and have lots of good things that they get from their Christian beliefs. Nor am I talking about Christianity per se, because there's a lot of different Christianities as well. And many of them have been in opposition to dominant Christianity. But I'm talking about a system of power and wealth and dominance that influences how we think and how we behave in our foreign policy, our domestic policy, and all of those kinds of areas.
Yeah. Which, I mean, do you think on that, because you write about the discovery doctrine and manifest destiny, I mean, those things, do you think those things are alive and well today? Especially in our geopolitical policy abroad?
Definitely. Also in our domestic policy. I mean, the doctrine of discovery is still cited in court rulings in this country as legitimate reasons for appropriating Native American land.
Right.
Manifest destiny is still how we talk about bringing benefits to other countries, whether it's aid or democracy or free markets or It's how we justify our interventions militarily. And of course, we name our enemies evil
Right.
and part of the axis of evil, etc., to drum up deep-seated patriotism around that sense that we are an exceptional country. We have a manifest destiny to save the world, etc.
What are, I mean, I get one of the other, I got a zillion questions, and I again appreciate your time, but in terms of like, what's been most challenging about your work, and what's been most rewarding or just challenging or rewarding?
Well, what's been rewarding is the people I work with and have contact with, and the vast number of people that have been brought into my lives doing this work. And it's also tremendously rewarding. I do a lot of mentoring and coaching at this point with younger activists and organizers, and the new generations of young leadership coming out of Black communities, immigrant communities, indigenous communities, and the white community. So that's, we lead such, in general, such segregated and limited lives as white people. It's really very transformative to be in multiracial, multi-class community, working together to actually build the kind of society we want to live in. The challenging part is that there is so much denial. There's such an active ruling class agenda and propaganda constantly feeding us lies and misinformation, including in our textbooks, in our public media, in our religious histories and stories. And so it's hard to know what's effective in this time in terms of organizing and various kinds of activism, and how do we show up? How can we show up in ways as allies in these struggles to those who are actually on the front lines of leading these efforts?
Yeah, I imagine you subscribe to this point of view too. I never realized that it was in my interest to end white supremacy, that it's in my interest to end patriarchy. I mean, is that, do you find people realizing that you work with? That it's not this kind of moral obligation, right, to assimilate into an imperial society, but in fact, it's in our interest as humans to do what you and I do.
Absolutely, and I know as well as I do the cost to us as men who have been socialized to benefit from the system, but also to pass on violence and control to those around us. And the moral and spiritual cost as well as the physical cost to us as white people from living in a system where our ability to be compassionate and loving to other people who are different than us has been completely cut off. Just as a couple of examples. Plus, we're so misinformed about our history, about who we are. We've lost so much, and we're losing so much, and now environmentally, we're losing the very substance of our lives in terms of the natural world, because these systems are, destroying the viability of life on the planet. So we have tremendous stakes personally for us and our children as men, as white people, as people with any kind of economic privilege, to be actively struggling to change things.
Yeah. Are you, and not to jump ahead on this thing, but given January the 6th, given the climate catastrophe that's staring us in the face, given the era of hyper individualism, I guess the questions I have are traditional movements possible anymore? You know what I mean? Because my folks on the left and then liberal circles often equate marches with movements, or mobilization with movements. But it seems to me we need sustained movements to challenge these things. And you and I lived in a time where we saw the Vietnam War anti-war movement, and now there's no presence really of an anti-war movement of any kind. So I guess where are you with all that, given what you saw in the 60s and 70s, like I did, in the context of today?
In the context of today, I mean, we see a tremendous international, people of color-led environmental justice movement. We see a Black Lives Matter movement. We see indigenous people coming together around struggles over land and fossil fuels and all kinds of things. We see an immigrant rights movement. I think that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of organizing. There's new generations of leadership that we don't know what change will come from. You know, it comes in many ways and often unexpectedly, but just in the last year, we've had tremendous movement in the US around the elections, around racial justice work, and resistance to fossil fuels, and working on various aspects of climate change. So yeah, I'm not neither hopeful nor despairing, but I certainly see a lot of evidence that this is a time where each of us needs to say, you know, where do I stand here? Who do I stand with? Am I showing up as an ally to people on the front lines and putting everything I have into that to make, to build the world we all want to live in, and that we want our children to live in?
Well, it seems to me that the ground is also getting fertile where people, like you said earlier, will have to almost choose sides, you know, in terms of, and I guess the other thing I wanted to ask related to that, were you, I see January the 6th and Donald Trump as backlash to progressive change. And were you surprised by January the 6th? Were you surprised by the election of Donald Trump after Barack Obama had 8 years in office?
Not at all. We have such a deep history of white supremacy and patriarchy and ruling class dominance that you know, it shouldn't be a surprise to us. We're also in the middle of a collapsing empire, and when you're inside of an empire that's collapsing, there's things falling and there's a lot of chaos, and
Right.
and the ruling class in their attempts to shore things up is going to give us a Black president, right, or allow that to happen, or a woman as president, or make some concessions. But it's not fundamental change at this point. But it's understandable that it's confusing, it's chaotic, it's unclear what's best to do. And there's already backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance.
Absolutely.
Against voting rights. It's clear that there's, you know, that, and I don't like to use war analogies or either or kind of analogies.
Right.
Those are very Christian. You're either with us or against us, right?
Right.
Or you're saved or you're a sinner. But there is a lot of opportunity for us to hold the complexity of what's going on and find a way to work together with others to build community, to stand for justice, to actually make forward progress from where we are.
Yeah. Well, I guess you know, crisis is opportunity, right? I think, or conflict can produce and present opportunity. The big questions I continue to struggle with, though, is just because you used the word empire a little while ago, and I'm like you, I just feel like we're in the midst of imperial decline, right? Like other empires have come and gone, but as a nation kind of founded on genocide, slavery, brutality, patriarchy, and one that, to me, when I look historically, I'm not sure how much transformation has happened. What I see is consolation. What I see is movements arising like suffrage or the labor movement or civil rights or gay rights. And what the system seems to do is then allow those folks in with some right privileges and statuses and access. But in terms of whole scale change and transformation, I'm not sure if it happens. And that's probably otherwise, for example, just one example, we wouldn't be worried about Roe v. Wade being reversed. Like we've got to talk about that again, right? And I don't know if that's too harsh a critique. And I just say that, Paul, as somebody, I was talking to a historian yesterday, as someone who lives in the South, where the South doesn't celebrate the loss of the Civil War. There's a cadre of people that still bemoan that, right? And so I guess as a social change agent for both of us, is that an unfair critique that what we've had is consolation, not reconciliation and transformation? What we've had reform, where now folks of color can participate in empire to some degree, right?
Well, I think that
does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's a good question that we need to be asking: is what we're doing commensurate with what we're up against?
Yeah.
And I think that that many of those things are reforms. The question is, are they reforms on the movement towards more fundamental change, or do we all go home after that and say, "Oh, we did it. Now it's okay."
Yeah.
And so that's constantly what I'm concerned about, is that we have to have a deep enough and clear enough analysis of what was of capitalism, of Christian hegemony, of white supremacy, et cetera, to understand that we have to keep pushing the limits, because we're a long way from the kind of fundamental transformation that will really shift power and really shift subvert the control of the ruling class of this country in ways that we can actually build what we want to build.
Right. And also not destroy the planet. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a real big question I grapple with, and I don't think that should stop us from what we do and how we live, right? I've had to struggle with letting go of the outcomes, because the doing, to me, like you said earlier, has made my life so much richer and shown me what the world can be like when we cross these boundaries and we try to be accountable and so forth. But at the same time, I've also witnessed the professionalization of social change work, right? And the institutionalization of that. And it saddens me when I used to teach and I'd have students that say, yeah, I want to change the world. I'm gonna get a job at a nonprofit, because that's the idea of what social change looks like for many people, right? This kind of siloed, professionalized, funded by corporate America often, right?
Right.
And that's kind of a whole nother struggle that we have to kind of overcome, it seems to me. I mean, is that too harsh?
No, I think that's very accurate. I've written an article called Social Change versus Social Service that really talks about that. And it means that we have to look at capitalism as a system, and not just moving things around on the capitalist table. The fundamental values of our economic system reinforce competition, economic inequality, exploitation, and violence. And that's, every time we move forward, we have to think about, well, how does this impact the actual operation of power in our society? And a lot of that power is the accumulated wealth of the ruling class and their ability to just keep coming back with those resources to subvert the civil rights gains that we made, or the gains in the 30s around working conditions and labor unions and wages, or the women's movement, or any of these things. We can't just work for a little while and then go home, because there are some people who are getting paid to work all the time to push an agenda that's against our interests, that's destroying the world.
Yeah. Well, I would also, I don't know if you feel this way or not, but it seems to me, I've been critical of diversity, because diversity has to mean more than a diverse power elite.
Right. Yeah.
I'm kind of a student of King. I seek the beloved community, which has a different value system than our dominant culture. And that question of how do we live in empire but try not to participate in it or support it's a big one that I don't have the answer to.
Well, and you remember that King talked about militarism and capitalism and poverty, and
Yeah.
he wasn't about just small scale change, because he realized that if we really want equality, that we have to work at the roots. We called our roots very often at the Oakland Men's Project root work, because it was getting at the roots that held these systems together, not just trimming the branches of the trees, right? Which is what a lot of nonprofits do in the nonprofit industrial sector, is just provide short-term limited services to those who are suffering and don't get to the roots.
Yeah, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but radical supposedly means to get at the root of something.
Right.
At least that's
Yeah.
what I've always kind of heard people say. Well, and I also listened to a talk you did and read your essay on the buffer zone that gets at some of this professionalization.
Right.
How even capitalism is so powerful. And I would really wish you would do kind of a similar book on capitalism, the logic and hegemony of capitalism and how it pervades our bones, and how we internalize value in ourselves based on material accumulation, right? And whether something can be sold for a profit or not. I've often said that, if we really loved ourselves, capitalism wouldn't work.
Right.
We wouldn't be out shopping. So
I did write a book called, you call this a democracy? Who benefits, who pays, and who decides, which is about the structure of capitalism.
Yeah.
And so I did try to, and it talks about the buffer zone and just the operations of various ways that the ruling class maintains power.
Yeah, one of the things I used to talk to students about is that every student I've always had, unless they were international, an international student, everybody had grown up playing Monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
And we would talk about the value system of, is that really a game? We played it at, our Christian camp, which is ironic that here we are worshiping a guy that says don't accumulate wealth, supposedly, and we're playing Monopoly, which basically teaches you that you have to destroy everybody to win,
Right. Well, and that's the depths of what we're up against. Is it's in our textbooks, and it's in the media, it's in the games, it's in, our common sense. It's just reinforced. So it's like racism and sexism. It's just, we're deeply socialized, where our minds are colonized by these systems. And we have to think about that as an ongoing, lifelong decolonization of our minds, as well as our external, relationships.
I always think about it in terms of detoxing, because I worked in substance abuse and mental health, right? Or that we all kind of are in recovery from these systems. And what does it look like to rehab? Like, how does one decolonize one's mind from capitalism or white supremacy? Has anybody generated like a how-to of suggestions in terms of lifestyle, right? Years ago, I read a book, Your Money or Your Life, that was really instrumental in getting me to think about the exchange of life for an hourly wage. But do you know if anybody's articulated how does one recover? How does one decolonize? I mean, I know tons of scholars have written about these things, but a pragmatic, practical suggestion booklet, I guess.
No, I haven't seen anything like that I know of. But again, it's not about our individual behavior.
Right.
And it's good for us to be trying to change our behavior and unlearn what we learned. And but it's ultimately it's about the systems. And we only actually can unlearn or change our habits and behavior in community with other people who are reinforcing that, right? And supporting that. So again, it's so easy to fall back to that individual level. What do I do? How do I live, etc.
Yeah.
But we have to see this as community work.
Yeah.
How do we work together to actually change not only ourselves and our practices, but our institutions?
Yeah. But the guidebook could be communal, right?
It could be, yeah.
Frame it. And I'm part of a couple of groups right now that are going through my grandmother's hands. It has to do with racial trauma, Resma Meniken's work. Right, who argues it has to be a kind of communal process. So maybe it's kind of like the big book of AA, 12 or 13 steps of communal recovery around these systems. And I don't know. It would,
right.
I think about it all the time, though. Can we go back? Go ahead.
I would just say one thing, which is, I think that work is really essential. And in a society that is so individualistic and concerned about individual moral worth,
right,
that if you start there, you generally don't get to the activism piece, to the community organizing piece. That we have to see it not just as the internal work, and not let the internal work just become the work.
Right. Well, and that's been my dilemma in a lot of the work I've been a part of, is that there hasn't been a good balance of the internal work with the external. I've been in groups that love to do external actions and projects, but we're not going to look at the dynamics in the room, right? Because we bring all this stuff in. But then there are the other groups that want to do all the kind of internal work, but no application in the broader world. So I don't know about you, but I've been in few spaces where we're doing both of those things. And even in the men's work I've been a part of, since it was funded and nonprofit, related, there was so many restrictions about it, even making statements about war when war broke out. You know what I mean? So it almost stayed in-house oftentimes and didn't get out into the community in a structural kind of way.
Right, and very much it focused on changing men's individual behavior, not doing community activism and organizing.
Back to January 6th for just a second. There's a part of me, because I live in the blood red state of Georgia. There's a part of me, because again, my neighbors are big Trump supporters. I have friends that are, family that are. It seems to me that there is a contingency of white Americans that probably would rather, that are heavily armed, that would rather probably destroy the country than share power. And it seems to me they're not going away, that January the 6th was maybe a test run, that they're radicalized. And I'm not sure if the left is, especially my liberal folks and folks that identify as Democrats and MSNBC watchers, it seems to me that the election of Joe Biden for them and getting rid of Donald Trump has made all of that kind of leave their consciousness. And is that too a paranoid a feeling, or do you think there's any merit in it?
No, I think it's pretty accurate. I mean, this is part of the ruling class strategy, is to have really dramatic elections and keep our attention on them for pretty much 3 out of every 4 years now. I mean, and that becomes a substitute for any kind of community activism, because it feels like participation. We're watching these races and we're betting on them and we're talking about them and we're voting, on voting day, etc. But in fact, they have very little significant difference in many ways. And so, but particularly for those who are progressive Democrats and others, we saw this after Clinton was elected. We saw after Obama was elected, is pretty much a lot of people go home. They get exhausted emotionally and physically by these races, by these elections, and then they assume that a savior is going to step in, i.e. the current Democratic candidate of whoever, and make things all right again.
Yeah. Or at least less worse, because one's
Or-
a lesser evil than the other one. Speaking
Exactly.
of Christian language, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But so yeah, it's a really huge problem in our political system, is that political activism has been reduced to voting once every couple of years.
Right.
And the rest of the time we kind of think, well, politics is over there, it's not election time, so I'm just going to get on with my life.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good point. Like, most folks I know think being political is voting. It's not how I spend my money. It's not that the political and power permeates all aspects of our lives, even our romantic relationships.
Right.
It's this
So,
relegated space and time.
yeah, I mean, it's a great strategy by the ruling class to keep us distracted. It's one of many distractions in our society, and feeling powerful because we vote, or self-righteous because we knew who was the best candidate.
Right.
But it actually doesn't shift very much at all. And especially now with the climate emergency, every time we look away, we lose ground. And so we elected Obama and then kind of went home, and we lost 8 years of of potential progress on dealing with the climate emergency. And we knew we were losing under Trump, but we're still losing under Biden. He's not doing the kinds of things that we need done to save the natural world in our lives.
Right. And our grandchildren's lives. Right. Well, I think that goes back to something else that I think about a lot, is that we're just also not a nation. And people have heard me say this more than once. We're a nation of consumers, not citizens. Most folks, even at our local level here, and I've certainly been guilty of this, I had to get politicized, but most Americans, we don't know our history, local or national, right? We've just know what we've been taught in our schools, but it seems to me too that we're not active citizens, that we're largely consumers, and whoever gets elected, if they can, as long as gas is cheaper, as long as those clothes come from, we don't really care where and who made them to some degree. That's who we want in office.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot more people care. And, with the election, a lot of people don't vote because it's clearly a rigged system between the electoral system and the voting disenfranchisement and the gerrymandering and everything else.
Corporate lobbying.
And corporate lobbying, that people are legitimately feeling disenfranchised and cynical about participating. And that's the only way that the ruling class actually can win, right? By keeping us cynical, by keeping us feeling that there's no way that we can make a difference. Because it's really, you talked about the right wing earlier. The conservative part of the population has been steady for probably a century or more. 25% to 30% of the population that are, very attached to where they think things should be.
Right.
Or
where they were.
where they were in parentheses, yeah. And they're armed and they're organized and they have a lot of financial influence. But in any kind of, but most people, that's the other 75%, have fairly progressive ideas and needs and wants around healthcare and education and the environment and jobs and equal opportunity, and so it's easy to start blaming people for not voting or blaming people for buying things, but in fact, again, we have to look at the big picture. It's not their individual decisions. It's the structural systems that keep
Right.
power in place.
Yeah, I don't think it's accidental at all, right? That we're ignorant of our local and national history, and that we've internalized that we have no right to hold elected officials accountable or even shape the destiny of the nation, right? That's all by design, by a ruling elite that wants us apathetic, wants us feeling powerless, and also wants us divided. How do you
And
feel?
it's a white Christian elite,
Yeah,
white Christian male elite.
yeah. I think that's why I don't work too much with white liberals anymore. Occasionally I do, but a lot of the work, and I find it actually uh, easier to do with conservatives in some ways because of common interest and common needs like adequate and affordable health care.
Right.
And
Well, and I
that's
think that's really key, is that when you really talk to people rather than making assumptions about them, a lot of us share really similar concerns about what's not working and what we'd like to see happen. And that's the basis of solid long-term organizing at the local level.
Yeah. I think Reverend Barber and other folks are doing a good job of it. And there's some history of right kind of populist work where folks came together, especially interracial, intergenerational stuff, right? So
Right.
how are you feeling about the future? It sounds like you're fairly optimistic. Are you? Do you feel encouraged by this new generation of mobilizations and activism that we've seen in the last year?
I definitely feel encouraged by that, and discouraged by other things that are happening, like the rapidity with which the environment is changing. I live in California, where the fires are ever-present reminder of just how much things have already changed.
Right.
I'm not pessimistic or optimistic. I feel like we have a lot of work to do, and that we can do it. However things turn out or keep developing, we're still going to have a lot of work to do.
Right.
And it's exciting and challenging and difficult and connecting work. And so, yeah, we need to do what we need to do to respond to what's happening and invite as many people as possible into that with us. We need to be constantly calling in more and more people to join us in this really amazing work of transforming the world.
Sounds great. Well, is there anything that you'd like to talk about that we haven't? I feel like I've kept you long enough, but if there's anything that I've said or anything that we should talk about, I want to open the floor up for it.
Not particularly. I just like people to know that there's a lot of resources on my websites, paulkivel.com and christianhegemony.org. And also in the books and curricula that we've written over the years, and also that they can call on me as a resource as well. And to thank you for the work you're doing with this podcast and the community organizing work, and I really appreciate and respect that.
Well, likewise, and like I said, you were one of the pivotal writers, and that was a resource and kind of another voice to start thinking about manhood and ways that has just been so, it's an overused word, but it was very healing and very validating as someone that's struggled with this whole idea of what it means to be a man and how so much of that didn't feel good and didn't feel right and feel moral and felt destructive. And so I'll always be indebted to the work you do and have done. So thank you for that.
Okay.
And thanks for making time today.
Sure. Take